Hello and welcome to Maximum Clash, the first talking book about the band. It was written and researched by Keith Rodway, music is by Amanda Thompson and it's read by Nancy McLean. You can check out our full catalogue on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk.
We were very naive when we started, and we didn't realise what an advance was. We thought it was a free gift, which it isn't. And, we're trying to patch things together. We're getting better at it all the time. I mean, our finances are a lot better conditioned now than it was a year ago today, But if we do some more mammoth tours, I don't really think it would be. So we're just trying to keep... live within our means and play within our means,
Punk bands and global capitalism were never supposed to go together. The whole ethos of the iconoclastic pop art movement that blew apart the stagnant British rock scene of the late 1970s was one of glorious, incendiary nihilism. Yet, like it or not, for many music fans, The Clash are synonymous with a posthumous top 10 single that was used to sell Levi's jeans. Such are the ironies in the confusing world of postmodern rock and roll. Beginning life on the streets of London's emerging punk fashion and music scene in 1976, The Clash was born of a desire to follow the example of the godfather of punk, John Lydon, then known as Johnny Rotten. The band went on to create a template for countless other bands that would follow, mixing the blood of three-chord rock and roll with the influence of another vital rebel music tradition, reggae. Yet The Clash were in essence an uncomfortable mix of contradictions. Hardly had the paint dried on punk's brand new rocket ship to Nirvana than The Clash were off to global stardom. They became stadium rockers of a generation for whom the very idea of capitalist mass consumption was supposed to be deadly anathema. Yet along the way they created a body of work that included the stunning double album of what would become Rolling Stone magazine's top album of the 1980s, the classic London's Burning. From their early days as the brainchild of founder members Mick Jones and Paul Simonon, through the pair's love-hate relationship with Joe Strummer, The Clash defined a whole new approach to rock music. They outlived the Sex Pistols, outclassed the Damned, and defied their detractors with a kind of arrogance and egotism that only true genius can command and justify. For years after their final split in the mid-1980s, rumours of a Clash revival kept hopes alive. Yet with Joe Strummer's premature death in December 2002, the final nail was hammered home. Although the punk era was long since dead, there was now no longer any hope of a revival. This is the story of The Clash, punk rock's most enduring legend.
I mean, Joe was the sort of person who would get really passionate about an idea and would go follow that route like a million miles per hour, and then somebody say, hey, but what about this? And they go, yes, you're right, and then they go a million miles in that direction. So I think we were fortunate really, because as a team we all complemented each other in various ways,
Punk heroes came in a variety of guises, many of which defied the rules. The whole movement, after all, was about burning the rulebook. Joe Strummer was no exception. Joe Strummer was born John Graham Meller on August 21st, 1952, in the Turkish town of Ankara. Strummer's father was not the white-collar worker Joe liked to claim, but a successful diplomatic clerical officer who was later awarded the MBE. Joe grew up with a love for the same material that inspired Bob Dylan, the songs and folk tales of the American Midwest, championed by Woody Guthrie. When his family relocated to the London satellite town of Croydon, he attended the exclusive City of London Freeman's School and graduated to art college. In 1970, he hit the streets as a busker under the name Woody Meller, in honour of his hero, together with his long-term friend and mentor, Timon Dog, a minor legend on the London busking scene. It was Timon who would supply the vocal for Lose This Skin, one of the more interesting tracks on the Clash's triple album Sandinista. He later became a member of Strummer's post-Clash band, the Mescaleros. After living a brief period in Wales, Strummer returned to a squat in London, 101 Alterton Road, where in 1974 he joined a band called El Hueso and the 101 All-Stars, later to become known simply as the 101ers. It was at this time that he chose his most enduring pseudonym, Joe Strummer, a name that conjures up both heroic working-class ordinariness and basic guitar technique. In his pre-punk incarnation, Strummer was very much the rock and roll lad about town, plying his earthy trade in London pubs with songs based on the common stock of post-folk and blues rock music. With a repertoire drawing on such disparate influences as Chuck Berry and Van Morrison, in his immediate post-them phase, the 101 All-Stars became something of a fixture in and around the pubs of the Maida Vale area of London, home to a variety of bohemians, squatters and artists. In order to afford the payments on a new Fender Telecaster guitar, Strummer entered into a marriage of convenience with a young American woman who was keen to acquire British citizenship. In the boys' own adventure world of mid-1970s rock music, welcomes were being comprehensively outstayed. The intensely experimental period following the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album had led to pop fracturing into psychedelia, progressive rock and heavy metal. The hangover experienced as the late 60s party dissolved in tears had led many music fans retreating to the cosy safety of the singer-songwriter scene. Religious visionaries and former teachers took to the stage in woolly jumpers and sang nice songs that lonely people in bedsits quietly wept to. Gigs in pubs were for the journeyman musicians. Real pop stars were worshipped by their fans in tens of thousands, packed into drafty stadiums. It was this agenda that the do-it-yourself punk movement was to rail against. Sounds of revved-up R&B, served with menacing precision by such bands as Southend-on-Sea's Dr. Feelgood, Chiswick's The Count Bishops, or Eddie and the Hot Rods. Fusing 60s pop with R&B classics from rock and roll's golden era of the 1950s, they provided a hangover cure that really rocked. It was against this backdrop that the former Woody Meller would meet two men who were to change his life.
It's quite diverse, isn't it?
Very diverse.
Different things to the
You know,
table,
it's
so to
like
speak.
you could go from as far from Anthony Newley to Billy Fury to Big Youth or Lee Perry to
Exactly, one of our
Mott the
great,
Hoople or
soundcheck
Bo Diddley,
was Pop Goes the Weasel.
Michael Jeffrey Jones was born in South London on the 26th of June 1955, the official year of the birth of that notorious problem child, rock and roll. Jones's upbringing was very different to Joe Strummer's. His father, Tommy, was a taxi driver based in the South London suburb of Clapham. When he and his wife Renee divorced, Mick's grandmother Stella looked after him while his dad continued to work. It was only later that he spent a brief period in the kind of high-rise block that punk kids dreamed of escaping from, a useful fact in the making of the Clash mythology. As a teenager, Mick grew up with the music of the late 1960s guitar heroes, glued to a radiogram, banging out Disraeli Gears by Cream and the Smash Hits LP by Jimi Hendrix. As a student at Hammersmith Art School, he became an avid fan of Mott the Hoople, an early 70s rock band fronted by Ian Hunter, a man whose vision of rock and roll cool necessitated having his sunglasses permanently attached to his face. The band had been on the verge of collapse when David Bowie saved them from oblivion with a song called All the Young Dudes. As a budding rock guitarist, Mick attended gigs in and around South London, joining local bands, leaving them, and forming new ones. A brief professional encounter with Guy Stevens, who could boast alliances with The Who, and who had produced Mick's idols Mott the Hoople, as well as 70s rock superstars Free and Spooky Tooth, saw Mick thrown out of his own band, Violent Luck, with the nominal excuse that his guitar playing failed to reach the required standard. In 1975, with a prevalent taste in mind for a mix of glam rock and the kind of Nazi chic pioneered by Visconti's film The Damned, Mick formed a new group, London SS, an unfortunate choice of name. The same film's title was later appropriated by former London SS members Brian James and Rat Scabies for their new band, who would go on to become one of punk's most enduring attractions. Shortly after his unhappy encounter with Guy Stevens, Mick encountered another veteran of the 1960s music scene, Bernard Rhodes. In the latter half of the 1960s, Rhodes had been attracted to the radical political stance of American poet-performers, the Fugs, as well as their compatriots on the late 60s garage punk scene, the MC5. Following a fraught association with future Sex Pistols manager Malcolm McLaren, Rhodes was keen to make an impact on the London music scene, an ambition that would later lead him to become the manager of The Clash. After the dissolution of London SS, he persuaded Mick to team up with a former NME journalist, American singer-guitarist Chrissie Hynde, to form a band called Big Girls Underwear. If big things were promised, they certainly didn't materialise, and soon Mick was investigating other avenues, still searching for the ideal partnership that would allow his talents to flourish. During this time, he played with many of the musicians who would go on to form seminal punk bands, including Glenn Matlock and Steve Jones of the Sex Pistols. Another young aspiring rocker, who'd auditioned for London SS but was turned down, would turn out to be a crucial name in the story of The Clash. His name was Paul Simonon.
Well, it's all sort of Yes and supergroups and
the thing was that they left you as they found you. You know, it was big concerts, and then you were there, you were in the audience, and then the band was up there. You know what I'm saying? And it was like very much. You may have enjoyed it and stuff, but in the end, you were still the same when you came out, and they were still up there. You know what I mean? And we kind of sort of broke down those barriers. You know, I think.
Paul Gustav Simonon was born in Thornton Heath, 3 miles south of Brixton in South London, on August 6, 1955. His father, Anthony, was a former insurance agent who trained himself as an artist and later became an active member of the Communist Party. When Paul was 3, his family moved to the sleepy seaside town of Ramsgate in Kent, the very antithesis of rock and roll street credibility. This was soon put right, however, when his parents split up and Paul lived with his mum just off Railton Road in Brixton, also known as the Front Line, the notorious focal point for much of the 1970s tension between black communities in London and the mainstream society. Part of the punk movement's importance was its tolerance of women, of whom there were many in punk bands, and its alliance with reggae, the lifeblood for many urban black people in 1970s London. The roots of urban reggae came from ska, popular with skinheads in the late 1960s, with hits like Israelites by Desmond Dekker. Skinheads were often associated in the media with racism and organised football hooliganism, with the fascist overtones of the National Front thrown into the mix. So it was curious that so many young white men who avidly collected records by top Jamaican artists apparently expressed such hostile racist views. When Paul was in his mid-teens living with his father in a high-rise block in Notting Hill, one of the livelier venues for reggae on a Saturday night was the Locarno in Streatham Hill, a predominantly working-class area in suburban South London. While his older brother Nick was grooving to the more middle-class strains of progressive rock bands like Yes, Paul was seeking out the kinds of records that would be played in pubs and clubs such as Locarno, frequented both by skinheads and the often much tougher young blacks. The effect this had on Paul would later be crucial to his input in The Clash. By 1976, many young people in Britain were becoming restless. Frustrated by dead-end jobs or rampant unemployment, alienated by pompous politicians, they were witness to a rapidly accelerating process of social change. It was against this often tedious and dreary backdrop that the Sex Pistols came roaring to prominence, sparking the explosion of creative energy that threw the tired rock music scene into such unflattering relief. After finishing at the Isaac Newton Secondary School in Notting Hill's Warnington Road, Paul followed the example of his father and enrolled at art school, where he met Mick Jones. In late 1975, Mick was still casting around for members of London SS, and Paul was learning to play bass guitar. Mick urged Paul to audition, which he did, without success. A year later, their paths crossed again. Bernie Rhodes had taken an interest in Mick's art school friend, as there was some physical resemblance between Paul and Richard Hell of the Voidoids, a New York new waver who affected homage to the Keith Richards style of wasted chic. At that time, Paul was only playing rudimentary bass guitar, but the criteria for Bernard Rhodes's ideal new wave rock band seemed to hinge as much on looks as musical ability. Mick and Bernard Rhodes wanted a band to rival the newly emerging Sex Pistols. When Mick again urged his friend to join the band, Paul became one of the luckiest men on the planet. He became the bass player in The Clash.
That was my department, was the art side of things, as well as trying to learn how to play bass. And so the paint dripping on clothes did sort of inspire a moment, oh, well, this is a bit like Jackson Pollock. And it sort of led on from there. So we had the paint splattered clothes. But Glenn Matlock actually did start off that thing himself. But the thing is that when I looked at it, they looked like Laura Ashley trousers. So I took it a stage further and gave it a bit of meat to it. And anyway, it became our look in the beginning.
In 1976, the Sex Pistols began a residency at London's infamous 100 Club. It was this series of gigs that gave a focus to the scene that had begun with the stripped-down R&B-based pub rock so prevalent in 1975. The British punk scene also drew influences from the garage punk bands of the late 1960s, such seminal outfits as the Stooges, fronted by the young Iggy Pop. By 1972, America had its own antidote to the soporific blandishments of soft rockers like the Eagles, a powerful sleeping draught in flared denims and Latino moustaches. Burning up the highway to the future came Jonathan Richman's The Modern Lovers, whose single Roadrunner and first LP was produced by ex-Velvet Underground left-field genius John Cale. Following behind came poet and ardent feminist Patti Smith, Talking Heads, Television and the Heartbreakers with Johnny Thunder. And acting as a further catalyst to unite these strands of influence were glam punk's The New York Dolls, with frightmare wigs, lurid makeup and platform heels permanently on the verge of glorious collapse. Looking as if drugs and malnutrition might finish them any day, they made a misunderstood first album, self-destructed in fine style and passed into the lofty annals of rock and roll mythology. Filled with a sneering loathing for anything and everything, and most of all, possibly himself, John Lydon, a former trench-coated fan of German experimental rock music, set aside his collection of Can albums and became Johnny Rotten, spike-haired leader of the New Revolution. With the Sex Pistols came the shocking jolt of rebellion that would send the nation into a frenzy of revulsion, as intense as the furore that had greeted Elvis Presley's first appearances on American television. A dizzying whirl of adverse publicity began with an appearance on an early evening TV show called The Today Programme. As last-minute replacements for Queen, the drunken punk band appalled the nation with their disrespectful attitude and copious bouts of swearing. In the fallout from this event, they ploughed their way through 3 successive recording contracts. They inspired strikes at EMI's pressing plant owing to their incendiary lyrics, and were later set upon by a gang of racist thugs claiming to be patriots, similarly incensed by their #1 single, God Save the Queen. This was all good news for the future members of The Clash. The Pistols had the energy and the attitude needed to galvanise an apathetic generation who professed themselves too bored to care that life around them was sinking into a thick sea of apathy. By 1976, the first lineup of The Clash, put together by Mick Jones and Paul Simonon, included Joe Strummer, whom they had become aware of during the days of the 101ers, a moody and inventive young guitarist called Keith Levine, also from the 101ers, and drummer Terry Chimes. Together they began to write and record the material that would be released on their first singles and eponymous debut album. With the intention in mind of avoiding love songs or blues progressions, they set about reflecting their lives and the world they lived in. The world of high-rise blocks, racial tension on the streets of Brixton, and booze and speed-fueled nights dancing in clubs. The old order of striking workers' unions, dysfunctional financial institutions, and a society reluctant to throw off the trappings of its collapsed empire was in its dying throes. Soon Britain would have its first woman Prime Minister and would enter a period of intense political, economic and social reform. Expressing the currents of anxiety among young people, running like tremors through street life, were the punks. At the head of the movement were the Sex Pistols, the Damned, and, before long, the Clash. The summer of 1976 was then one of the hottest in recent memory. Hundreds of thousands of eager revellers gathered in the streets of Notting Hill for the yearly street carnival, hosted by London's West Indian community on the Monday of the August bank holiday. An attempted arrest of a young black man by a considerable number of policemen near the concrete flyover known as the Westway sparked a surge of anger among the watching crowd. Before long, a full-scale riot had ensued. It was this event that inspired the Clash's first single, White Riot, an adrenalised rush of urban angst. By the time of its release, the Clash had undergone personnel changes. Keith Levene had left, following negative reviews of the band's early gigs in the underground press. He would later reappear in John Lydon's post-Pistols band, Public Image Limited. Terry Chimes would follow him shortly after the band had recorded the tracks for their first LP, to be replaced briefly by future Culture Club drummer John Moss. Released on March the 18th, 1977, the single reached a peak of number 38 in the charts. Not a remarkable showing by conventional standards, but a notable achievement in view of the fact that it received virtually no airplay. The nation's airwaves were not yet ready to admit that changes in their musical diet were afoot, as the next year would show.
Bernie said, right, let's get in a car and let's go down, we're going to sign the Polydor. And then he was on the phone, I don't know.
I remember calling really early in the morning and said, no, we're not going, we're going to CBS. We all went and signed.
We didn't know where we were going, really.
We didn't know what was happening. We went off and signed that deal, right, and then we went to see the Battle of Midway, didn't we?
Thinking of we could buy Dingwalls now.
As a cultural phenomenon, punk did not arrive overnight. And for a movement that prided itself on its anti-establishment stance, there were several glaring anomalies. Not least of these was the Clash's choice of record label, CBS, the British arm of the American recording giant Columbia. CBS was the home of Bob Dylan and Leonard Cohen, and was at that time one of the three most powerful recording organisations in Britain. Legend has it that in 1976, the band's initial demos had ended up with Polydor Records, but that Bernard Rhodes subsequently negotiated a lightning deal with CBS, who were desperate to get themselves in on the punk bandwagon. They were not alone in this. The Sex Pistols had been signed to EMI Records alongside Queen, Kate Bush and Cliff Richard, who were hardly the most cutting-edge revolutionaries in pop at that time, or indeed any other. Following their abrupt dismissal from this august institution, they moved swiftly to A&M Records, which handled, among others, the Carpenters. A&M stood for the names of the label's founding directors, Herb Alpert and Jerry Moss. Herb Alpert had had a run of cheesy hit singles in the 1960s based on the popular music of the Mexican town of Tijuana. When A&M also summarily cancelled the band's inclusion on their roster of recording artists, the Pistols found a more convivial home with Richard Branson's Virgin record label. Virgin's fortunes had been boosted 3 years earlier by the huge revenues earned from Mike Oldfield's quasi-classical LP, Tubular Bells. All of this was a long way from high-rise blocks and teenage despair. Also emerging on the punk scene were the Stranglers, who were collectively old enough to have only recently abandoned their flared jeans, and who sped up their songs to keep pace with the emerging trend. It was they who, along with the Sex Pistols, the Damned and the Clash, formed the first division of the punk bands. As an icon of punk culture, the debut album by The Clash, released on April the 8th, 1977, and titled simply The Clash, bore all the hallmarks of an instant classic. With songs like White Riot, Remote Control, London's Burning, Garageland, and Career Opportunities, they reflected the themes of marginalisation felt by many young Britons in the year of Queen Elizabeth's Silver Jubilee celebrations, held all over the country to mark the 25th year of her reign. A drastically different version of the album was released 2 years later in America, with subsequent singles substituted for album-only tracks. In one carefully staged image, the cover of The Clash summarised the band's major preoccupations. Based on the sleeve of a dub album by reggae artists Joe Gibbs and The Professionals, the front shot showed Joe Strummer, Mick Jones and Paul Simonon posing moodily in the confines of a narrow alleyway. On the reverse was a photograph taken at the Notting Hill riot 6 months earlier. Drummer Terry Chimes was credited under the nickname Tory Crimes. The artwork was assembled to look as if the images had been torn from a billboard or from a fan magazine, and was printed in black, dirty green and lurid orange. A feature article in the New Musical Express in April 1977 proclaimed Mick Jones, Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon to be the thinking man's yobs. Included among the album's tracks was a brilliant reworking of the reggae anthem Police and Thieves, originally written and recorded by Junior Mervyn and the legendary Jamaican maverick producer Lee Scratch Perry. This, juxtaposed with White Riot and the Union Jack badge worn by Paul Simonon on the album cover, resulted in awkward questions arising concerning the apparent contradictions inherent in the band's political affiliations. And the invective of Joe Strummer's song, I'm So Bored with the USA, would seem to ring hollow in subsequent years. Peaking at number 12 in the charts, the album was instrumental in bringing punk into the mainstream, much to the disappointment of the purists, who thought that it should remain an underground phenomenon. Refugees from other musical persuasions were already swelling the movement's ranks. To get signed to one of the many labels trampling each other in the rush to get their piece of the action seemed simple. All you had to do was tear your clothes, stick them back together with safety pins, and bang out angry songs about being bored and depressed and having no hope of a future. With any luck, your audience would spit at you. Such were the rites and rituals on the planet punk. Following the departure of John Moss from the band, The Clash set about finding a permanent drummer. Mick Jones reached back once again into his past with London SS and recruited Nick Topper Hedden to fill the vacant seat. Born in Bromley in Kent on May 30th, 1955, Nicholas Bowen Hedden's teenage preoccupations were the Beatles, the American boogie blues band Canned Heat, and football. As a drummer, his career included a brief stint with long-haired 70s muso Pat Travers. He then progressed to a band fronted by future Commodores member J.D. Nicholas before finally moving on to The Clash. In May 1977, The Clash embarked on punk's first major British outing, the White Riot Tour. Closely modelled on the Sex Pistols' Anarchy in the UK tour of the previous year. Support acts on the White Riot Tour included the all-girl band, The Slits, with Mick Jones' girlfriend Viv Albertine, the Buzzcocks, Generation X and Subway Sect. After a spate of excellent singles recorded in late 1977, including Remote Control and White Man in Hammersmith Palais, The Clash spent much of the following year working on their second album. Released on the 10th of November 1978, Give 'Em Enough Rope saw the band's hard-won credibility with punk's collective audience take a serious slide, and it would be some time before they could redeem themselves. By then, punk was largely brain dead, and The Clash would move away from their original agenda and into a new era.
Joe said it was nerves because I'd never been on stage in my life. Mind you, I did go on stage once. I won 5 bob for a painting competition at school, but But other than that, sort of suddenly there's... But the thing is that when you go on stage, as long as you know what you're doing, then you're fine. But I was still trying to learn my instrument, and the review, interestingly enough, said, yeah, the Clash, you know, Dr. Phil could have wiped the floor with him. And you know, the bass player had to go over to the guitarist to ask him to tune the guitar for him.
In 1977, the Clash had been numbered among the most highly respected heroes of the punk revolution. 1978 saw all that change. Among the sessions in autumn 1977 for their run of singles that followed their first album was a collaboration with Lee Perry, resulting in their third single, Complete Control, and a cover version of the reggae classic Pressure Drop, originally by Toots and the Maytals. The band's involvement with Perry inspired the Bob Marley song, Punky Reggae Party, which name-checks The Damned, The Jam and The Clash in its lyric. It was released as the B-side to his single Jamming, from the LP Exodus. Further reggae references included Clash City Rockers, a respectful nod to the upbeat style pioneered by veteran reggae session drummer Sly Dunbar, and the band's decision to take reggae DJ and filmmaker Don Letts on their second tour. To award themselves the feeling of having really immersed themselves in the culture, they later blagged enough money from manager Bernie Rhodes to take a 2-week working holiday in Kingston, Jamaica. When it came to their second album, however, the pressure was on from CBS to show positive returns from their investment in the group. Although hailed as punk classics, their first album and subsequent singles had not set the tills at CBS ringing urgently enough. Accordingly, it was decided that a new approach must be taken. Unhappily, this had meant drafting in American producer Sandy Pearlman to work on Give 'Em Enough Rope. One of Pearlman's most shining achievements had been his input on the album Agents of Fortune by Blue Oyster Cult, an American hard rock band whose hit single Don't Fear the Reaper had seen them turn into a watered-down, chart-bound version of the Byrds. Drawing on their collective enthusiasms, Mick Jones and Joe Strummer began to delve into the past for inspiration, thereby defeating the whole point of being in a punk band, which was always supposed to be about now, or, if you were really cutting it, the uncertainty of the future. Accordingly, Strummer's song Last Gang in Town contained references to Cajun and rockabilly, while Mick Jones's Stay Free revealed the influence of his teenage heroes Mott the Hoople, a connection further compounded by All the Young Punks, a punk update on All the Young Dudes. Add to this the plodding AOR production values of Sandy Pearlman, and you had a critical disaster waiting to happen. Despite this, the album reached number 2 in the charts, while the band finally scored their first top 20 hit with the single Tommy Gun. In 1978, to describe the cleaned-up second and third wave of punk bands, the movement began to mutate into the more respectable-sounding new wave, allowing an increasingly more adult audience to join in the fun through buying records by the likes of U2, The Police and Simple Minds. By rejecting the nihilism of punk and its associations with inner-city violence and decay, these bands could cheerfully join the queue to crack the lucrative US market, with its taste for grandiose stadium gigs in the style of Bruce Springsteen, without seeming to compromise any political principles. On the 21st of October 1978, tensions between the Clash and their manager Bernard Rhodes had reached an impasse, and Rhodes was sacked. Paul Simonon's girlfriend, Caroline Kuhn, a member of the band's inner circle since their inception, took over. This coincided with the release in America of Give 'Em Enough Rope on Columbia Records' sister label Epic. Accordingly, the band flew on January the 30th, 1979 to Vancouver in Canada, where they played the next night to a highly appreciative audience at the Agora Ballroom. Just over a fortnight later, on the 15th of February, the band played the New York Palladium. Among the audience were Bruce Springsteen, Andy Warhol, Nico, and Robert De Niro. This was followed by a piece on the band in Time magazine. By now, it seemed clear that punk really was dead, and the Clash were becoming a highly respected mainstream rock band.
Well, I mean, for me personally, I come up to Guy and say, "Oh, Guy, I did some bum notes." He said, "It doesn't matter. Let's keep going. Let's do the next record, the next one." He was,
it's like a catalyst for what was going on, and then he'd like build it up. I mean, it was very.
He was like a vibe merchant, really. He just got the vibe just right.
Whatever might have been the limitations of the Clash's second album, with its focus on guns, paranoia and terrorism, by the time of gathering material for their third album, their period in the doldrums seemed magically to evaporate. On the 11th of May, 1979, the band released an EP entitled The Cost of Living, a reference to the spiralling inflation that would be the first test for the newly elected Conservative Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher. The EP's 4 new songs set the tone for the band's next release, the triumphant return to classic form, London Calling. No longer burdened with the stigma of punk, by then seen generally as a charming period of do-it-yourself youthful exuberance, the Clash could turn themselves into a proper rock band, allowing both Jones and Strummer to follow in the footsteps of their respective heroes from rock's old guard. They would become known as the New Wave's answer to the Rolling Stones. With heavy irony, CBS had seen fit to charge the then exorbitant sum of £1.49 for the Cost of Living EP, fueling further animosity between the band and its label. The Clash had always felt that CBS regarded them as something of a liability. Yet now, having heard demos for the new songs the band were writing, CBS warmed to the idea of financing their third album. At Mick Jones' suggestion, former Mott the Hoople producer Guy Stevens, a notorious music business maverick, was brought in to produce the material that would become London Calling. Recorded in a manic burst of creative energy over 4 weeks, the album was to be Guy Stevens' final burst of glory before dying of an overdose of prescription drugs in 1981. Anecdotes concerning his eccentric behaviour during the recording of the Clash's third LP, released on the 14th of December 1979, are prolific and legendary. But whatever the nature of his madness, his methods worked. The album had been trailed by the release of the single, also called London Calling, a week previously, with a video filmed by Don Letts. Problems with CBS reappeared when the band insisted that the new release be a double album, a move that would have been considered a heinous crime in punk's heyday. In the 1970s, double albums were almost exclusively the preserve of dinosaur bands who chose to showcase their live stage act with rambling versions of their greatest hits. No self-respecting 1970s rock band could be without one. With their new management team, Black Hill Enterprises, who had by then replaced Caroline Coon, the Clash negotiated with CBS to be allowed to give away a free single with their new album, a marketing ploy tried and tested a year previously with the American release of their debut LP. When CBS agreed, the band insisted that it should be a 12-inch single. Not only that, but it should contain 8 tracks. In the end, it totalled 9, and the album retailed for just under £5. The Clash had won their first significant blow against corporate greed. But there was another reason for making London Calling a double album. The Clash's original contract for CBS stipulated that they provide 8 albums. Joe Strummer, who wished to be free of the label, believed that London Calling would count as 2 out of the 8. Furthermore, when their next LP, the sprawling indulgent Sandinista, emerged in 1981, the band delivered a triple album, thereby assuming that they only had 1 record left to deliver. They were mistaken. Each album counted only as a single release.
Well, his name was Nicholas Hedden at the time, but for some unknown reason I started calling him Topper. I think it was referring to that comic. Well,
no,
it's his ears.
The Topper comic, right, and the front of that used to be Mickey the Monkey, and he had really big ears.
Well, yeah, I mean, I remember when he first turned up. I mean, like, thing is, he beat all the drummers out of town by his sheer playing ability. But, yeah, I mean, like, drumming style, it was just sort of, it punctuated everything that we had to say, and it's like Mick's always said that, you know, a group is really only as good as its drummer, and we are sort of fortunate that we got the best one, you know.
Not all the reviews for London Calling had been complimentary. Along with the now commonplace assertion that punk had been sold out, there were reservations about the band's macho posturing and its reliance on the guns and gangsters imagery of many of their songs. But with the Sex Pistols long since redundant, and the sordid death of their bass player Sid Vicious and his girlfriend Nancy Spungen, it was clear that punk and capitalism had little in common from the outset, and were in fact a contradiction in terms. Further flack was directed at the Clash for the triple album Sandinista. Tensions in the band had been rife for some time. On the one hand was Mick Jones, who was seen by the press as a frustrated rock guitarist who wanted to be Keith Richards, with all the trappings of rampant egotism. On the other was Joe Strummer, keen to be viewed as a principled left-wing sympathiser trapped in an anomalous capitalist enterprise. Stuck in the middle was Paul Simonon, then working through his obsession with guns. The situation between Joe and Mick came to a head on January the 27th, 1980, during a gig at the Sheffield Top Rank, when the two became involved in a fight on stage. By now, Topper Headon was also having problems, mostly relating to his prodigious drug intake. A projected single release, Bank Robber, was vetoed by CBS Supremo Maurice Oberstein, who had taken exception to reggae producer Mikey Dread's mix. The single was eventually released on August the 8th, 1980. All in all, things were not going well at Clash Central. In the autumn of 1980, all four members of the Clash, along with Timon Dog, Norman Watt-Roy, Mickey Gallagher and Davey Payne from Ian Dury's band The Blockheads, made contributions to an album by Mick Jones's girlfriend, singer Ellen Foley. In October, two Clash projects were released: the 10-inch mini-album Black Market Clash, only available in the US, which comprised various Clash rarities. The band's fourth album of new material, Sandinista, named after the communist Nicaraguan guerrilla rebels, was released in Britain on the 12th of December 1980 and retailed at a bargain of £5.99. The album saw the band experimenting with rap, funk, dub and rock, and contained a staggering 36 tracks, with Mikey Dread contributing to the production duties. It received an almost unanimous critical lashing, but its groove-based approach was to prove to be an influence on the British bands of the late 1980s, who fused psychedelic 60s-style rock with dance music, particularly Primal Scream and the Stone Roses. In 1981, in a move relating to the long-running struggle between Strummer and Mick Jones to wrest control of the Clash, Joe Strummer issued an ultimatum. Either their original manager, Bernie Rhodes, was reinstated, or Strummer would leave the band. Joe missed Rhodes' capacity for generating ideas, and the first project with Bernie back on board was a 12-inch single comprising a DJ mix of the third single from Sandinista, The Magnificent Seven. Following this, they began a week-long residency late in May 1981 at Bond's Casino on Broadway in New York. Here they discovered that New York radio DJs were playing the dance mix of The Magnificent Seven, entitled not very originally, The Magnificent Dance, on heavy rotation. Not only that, but they were spinning samples from American film director Don Siegel's film Dirty Harry, starring Clint Eastwood, over the track, thus presaging some of the mix techniques Mick Jones would later use in his post-Clash band Big Audio Dynamite. Following the release later in 1981 of Don Lett's film about the band, Clash on Broadway, the band took stock of their financial and personal positions. Amazingly, since the release of their first album in 1977, and despite their legendary status, they had been permanently in debt to CBS. They were now faced with the realization that, after all these years, they were still struggling to achieve true mainstream success. They had finally admitted that, despite their punk rock commitment to giving value for money, often at personal cost to themselves, big-time success was now their true goal. To rub salt into an already sensitive wound, their single This Is Radio Clash, released on the 11th of November 1981, failed to set the charts alight, stalling at number 47. Something needed to be done to save the Clash from impending oblivion. Accordingly, work began on their 5th studio album, Combat Rock, which contained the remarkably prescient Mick Jones song, Should I Stay or Should I Go? At Mick's insistence, sessions were begun in New York with Glyn Johns, who had mixed an abandoned version of the Beatles' Let It Be album, as well as having produced the Who's legendary Who's Next LP. But problems still dogged the Clash. On the eve of their April 1982 UK tour, Joe had walked out of the band for an unannounced leave of absence, only to return a month later. In May, Topper Headon's drug habit and increasingly unreliable behaviour had become unfeasibly disruptive, and he was sacked, to be replaced by the ever-reliable Terry Chimes, taking up his old job for the 3rd time. His tenure would not last long, however, as he became tired of the constant bickering between the other band members. Then, in September of the following year, came the real bombshell. Joe Strummer and Paul Simonon had finally decided they could take no more of Mick Jones's rock star posturing and arrogance. Not for the first time, Mick was unceremoniously thrown out of his own band. 2 years later, he would return to public prominence with his new band, Big Audio Dynamite, mixing rock, funk, hip-hop and spoken word samples into a brave new hybrid. But before that, there was to be the Clash Mark II, as Strummer and Simonon tried to reconcile their position. They would make one last stab at keeping the Clash a viable proposition.
We used to come into a city and then they'd say, okay, you all line up over that wall over there, and then they come on Rex, and they bring a dog and they go all over our stuff, you know. And some of the guys had like bad socks and stuff, and then the dog would be going woof woof, really go mad, and they would go, okay, all right. So we didn't have nothing, but you know, because we were really pretty used to it, and we'd get spin everywhere.
Combat Rock had been released to favourable critical reviews on May 14, 1982. With production duties largely handled by Joe Strummer himself, in defiance of Mick's customary assumption of that role, the new album had found the Clash on familiar ideological and stylistic territory, still pursuing their old obsessions. Earlier the previous year, Martin Scorsese had announced plans to film an epic story of the lives of Irish immigrants in New York, to be called Gangs of New York. Having, presumably, picked up on the Clash's all-boys-together gang mentality and confrontational political stance, he approached the band with a view to including them on the project, either as contributors to the soundtrack or as actors. In the event, the project was postponed, finally appearing 20 years later. Combat Rock had peaked at number 2 on the British album charts and stayed for 23 weeks. By then, the Clash had achieved a remarkable feat. They had begun to show a profit, owing to much hard work touring the previous year and to the combined sales of London Calling and Sandinista. Despite a triumphant tour of the US, and with the controls of the band's revitalised rocket ship to the stars set firmly for the heart of maximum profit, they had been unable to sell their new single, Mick's song Should I Stay or Should I Go, to American record buyers. It would take a much larger global conglomerate, Levi's Jeans, to achieve that feat 9 years later. The band had closed a highly successful year with a series of gigs in Jamaica, where the country that had given them so much potent inspiration finally took the band to their hearts. Then in May 1983 came the most significant breakthrough yet. The band had been offered $500,000 to appear at a 3-day festival in Los Angeles, hosted by Apple Computers. They were to headline New Music Day. Their dreams of becoming fully paid-up stadium rockers had come true. A drummer, 23-year-old Pete Howard, was hired for the occasion. Yet, because presumably this was the Clash, who prided themselves on their right on political values, there was to be trouble. They aggressively insisted on donations being made by both the promoters and the other bands taking part to a children's charity, and erected a sign reading, "The Clash Not For Sale," on the stage behind them. Why, in that case, had they accepted $500,000 to appear? fights backstage marred the event. The Clash was still yobs, and without, apparently, a thinking man in sight. Following Mick's departure, the band allotted themselves the brief of taking on the rock world under the dubious banner Punk's Not Dead. In fact, Punk had expired from a bullet wound to the head the day the Sex Pistols took the decision to sign a recording contract, never mind which one, and the pop music of the 1980s proved the point. There was no longer any pretense to adhere to agit-pop principles. Pop in the 1980s was about conspicuous consumerism and financial success, with bands increasingly being assessed not by their artistic merits, but by how many units they'd shifted. The Western world was the pleasure palace of an increasingly socially divisive world, and fuck you if you were on the wrong side of the divide. The Clash Mark II was expanded to a 5-piece unit, with Joe and Paul in the front line, Pete Howard on drums, and 2 unknowns, Nick Sheppard and Vince White, brought in on guitar, since Joe had now decided to concentrate on his duties as frontman. With Mick Jones allegedly threatening to form his own Clash Mark II with Topper Headon, and possibly to challenge Joe and Paul for the use of the name, the race was on to get out there and establish who between the two camps would deliver the goods first. In the end, it was Joe and Paul, who released Cut the Crap, a derisory album swamped with nasty 1980s synthesizer sounds and a jumble of unworkable ideas. The press hated it, and the band seemed to agree. In the end, the blame was attributed to Bernie Rhodes, apparently another of his delusional schemes that offered to serve no one but himself.
I don't know about sort of success and that. I mean, if you can get an audience and you can fund going into the studio and make and put out records, then I think that's as much success as you want, or as you can hope to ask for.
Released in 1985, Cut the Crap was an attempt to re-establish old-school punk values in a world that had committed itself to an obsessive desire for style, with content as an optional extra. The hottest acts of the day were Dire Straits, Madonna, Prince and Michael Jackson, and Bruce Springsteen, who at least managed to defy the new logic with actually having something to say. Furthermore, he was above forcing vacuous homilies down his audience's throat while stuffing his back pockets with fresh wads of nice hot Yankee dollars. Cut the Crap's inner sleeve manifesto urged its audience to be aware that radical change begins on the street. Cut the crap and get out there. Nobody, of course, really believed that the revolution would be televised on MTV, although in a way it was, but not the revolution envisaged by Joe Strummer. At that time, Mick Jones had long since abandoned his own plans to form the Clash Mark II, and was putting all his energies into Big Audio Dynamite, with he and Don Letts in the studio working on the first album. Joe had attempted reconciliation, trying to tempt Mick back for one more go at the Clash. What he had failed to realise was that his old friend and sparring partner had moved on. Mick was gaining inspiration from hip-hop. Joe was still a roots music fan. They had grown worlds apart. Notwithstanding this, in 1986 the two worked together briefly on the soundtrack for Alex Cox's film Sid and Nancy, a biopic of the doomed Sex Pistol and his dysfunctional, heroin-addicted girlfriend. Joe was now a man in early middle age, with 2 young children, and Mick would soon be revelling in his top 20 success with his new band. Joe helped produce their second LP, Number 10 Upping Street, and co-wrote some of the material with Mick. In many ways, the album stands a much better full stop to a vanished era than Cut the Crap, which was a Clash album in name only. By then, the constant round of head games in the Clash camp had led guitarist Nick Sheppard to wonder which was worse, being in the Clash or not being in the Clash. In the end, the decision was made for him. Paul and Joe apologised to him, Vince and Pete Howard, and paid them £1,000 each. The Clash was officially finished. A year later, Joe appeared with Courtney Love in Alex Cox's much-maligned film Straight to Hell. A cleaned-up, drug-free Nick Topper, too, had entered the ex-Clash Members Club with his own album, which the press quite liked and which the public avoided. A year after that, in 1988, Columbia released a Clash retrospective, The Story of the Clash Volume 1. Then in 1991, 6 years after the release of their last album, The Clash finally achieved the holy grail of all pop bands, a #1 single. A new advertising campaign for Levi's jeans featured Should I Stay or Should I Go, and a single, backed with a big Audio Dynamite track, was released to worldwide acclaim. This was followed by a glut of Clash-related releases. March 1991 saw the re-release of This Is the Video Clash, originally released in 1989, and The Story of the Clash Volume 1. This was followed in October by the mid-price CD release of the band's debut album, to be followed eventually by the rest of their back catalogue. In November, the world was treated to a CD release called The Singles, and in the same month came the US-only appearance of the box set Clash on Broadway. The very idea of a punk box set conjures up uncomfortable images of middle-aged men and women wearing Mohican wigs, smashing up their coffee table and tastefully arranging their Clash or Sex Pistols box set in the debris. In the real world, Clash fans were dismayed that the title seemed to place emphasis on America, and there was the usual heated debate about what had been included and what had been left out. The following year, an updated Black Market Clash was released on CD under the name Super Black Market Clash, with an additional vinyl format in the shape of 3 10-inch LPs. As the 20th century drew to a close, news came that Joe Strummer was back in business with a new band. The Mescaleros found Joe in familiar territory, fusing roots music from a variety of sources with his own inimitable approach. An album, Rock Art and the X-Ray Style, was followed by a single, Yalla Yalla, and well-received appearances during 1999 on stage and at festivals. In 2000, the Mescaleros reached a wider audience supporting The Who, and at that year's Q Magazine Awards, Joe was honoured with a Lifetime Achievement Award. This was followed by a second album, Global A Go-Go, and the appearance of a track on a benefit album for the West Memphis 3 saw Joe responding to his political inclinations, contributing a cover version of Jimmy Cliff's The Harder They Come, which featured reggae veteran Tipper Irie. This was followed by Minstrel Boy, a track commissioned for the 2001 film Black Hawk Down. Though not always loved by the critics, the public, including many former Clash fans, were happy to see Joe undergoing a renaissance as he approached his midlife 50th birthday. But sadly, it would not last.
We're going to try and do another album, but you have to live from day to day in this game. You never know what can happen, and I don't know, I've got a lot of talented players here. Any one of them could get poached, and going off the road to make an album is in itself slightly dangerous, because you built a team up. It's not only the group but the crew, and going off the road to make a record, you can't split the team up, so that's a worry. But we'll see what happens.
At a Mescaleros gig in November 2002 at Acton Town Hall, the audience were treated to a special surprise. Mick Jones joined Joe on stage for 3 encores. The 2 former Clash frontmen joined together to sing on Bank Robber, White Riot and London's Burning. This was followed by rumours of a full Clash reunion for their induction into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame in March 2003. Joe was quoted as saying that after a while, not only do you bury the hatchet, but you forget what the hatchet was. Whether or not the reunion would have been a one-off, or whether there may have been plans for new material, was never made fully clear. With so much water having flowed under the collective bridge, the time may have been right for the 4 original members to forget their differences and see where playing as the Clash in the new millennium would have led them. The release in 2001 of the first live Clash album, From Here to Eternity, had proved that there was still interest in the band. The same year saw the release of the video documentary West Way to the World, with Joe, Mick, Paul and Topper contributing remarkably frank interviews. The DVD version included a bonus appearance of Don Lett's film Clash on Broadway. Late in 2002, the Mescaleros were working on material for their third album. With Joe and Mick having appeared together on the same stage, it seemed that anything could happen. But then, on December the 22nd, came the tragic news that Joe had died from a heart attack at the age of 50. Nature had finally put paid to rumour and speculation. The final chapter in the story of The Clash was closed. While the music world mourned one of its great original heroes, it may have pondered on what might have been. How would a reformed Clash have related to life in the 21st century? With so many problems behind them, with the benefit of the maturity that comes with middle age, would they have had anything relevant to say? Many artists have weathered lean, creative years and had reinvented themselves to enjoy new leases of life, with Bob Dylan the most notable example. The world was still a place where hardship and injustice were rife, and the conflict between the nominally Christian West and the phenomenon that had become known as global terrorism would give much scope for reflection. Perhaps, though, the Clash were a product of their times, and of the apparently limitless energy and optimism of youth. Those times had gone long before, as attempts to revive the band following the natural expiry of their sell-by date had shown. Punk rock in the 21st century was essentially limited to marketing and exploitation, another faction of the music industry's obsession with retro culture, rather than by principled adherence to ideas and ideologies. With Joe Strummer's death, an era had passed. To many, the world seemed a poorer place without him, and without bands whose sense of commitment to their ideals had given the Clash their power and resonance in a world that had been hungry for change.
Thanks for buying Maximum Clash. We hope you enjoyed it. Watch out for further titles on Chrome Dreams coming up soon. If you did enjoy or have any comments or suggestions, write to us at Chrome Dreams, PO Box 230, New Malden, Surrey, UK, KT36YY, or email on mail@chromedreams.co.uk. Details of our full catalogue are listed on our website at www.chromedreams.co.uk. Thanks again for listening, and goodbye for now.